Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Smith, Executive Director of the American Political Science Association, and welcome you to the panel, The Future of Polarization and the Future of American Democracy. We have a great panel today, and we're going to go in the order of people listed on the program. So Andra Gillespie from Emory University will go first. Jacob Hackett from Yale University will go second. Ursula Hackett from Royal Holloway University will go third. Des King from Nuffield College, University of Oxford will go fourth, and Jim Morone will go fifth. Jim is from Brown University. I'm going to give each panelist 5 minutes to answer the question, what's the biggest challenges facing American democracy today? Then I will ask a follow-up question about what are your recommendations on how we can address some of the challenges and problems that people have identified? And then I hope to get a lot of questions and answers from questions from the audience. And I will ask everybody to post their question in the chat. And then I will ask those questions of the panel members. So without further ado, Andra, go ahead.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I feel really honored to be in discussion and in dialogue with such esteemed colleagues. The first question is about what is the most serious challenge facing American democracy today? And I'm going to try to keep my comments relatively short, so I'll hopefully come in under the allotted 5 minutes. But I think probably the best way to sum up the problem facing American democracy today is that we have a problem of polarization. That notion of polarization is multifaceted. And so in the remainder of my time, I want to highlight a few things that I do think are actually helping to exacerbate those problems. One of them is actually a good thing. And so part of this, and we'll get to this in the second part of the discussion, is trying to figure out how to manage diversity. And so as much as we would like to say that diversity is our strength, and I very much believe that that is the case, the truth is when a society is confronting increased diversity, and in particular when people are confronting the fact that the people who are accustomed to being in power have to share power with other people, it's probably inevitable that there are going to be some speed bumps and that there's going to be some resistance to what's going on. The issue is the extent to which we are seeing people being motivated by things like racial resentment, sort of a perceived loss of social dominance orientation, and other political psychological factors that really are strong predictors of vote choice and predictors of policy preference. So I hope we get a chance to discuss that today. Somewhat related to this is the idea that we don't agree on terms, and this has been a hallmark feature of American government. So I actually used Jim's textbook in my own class, and we were talking about this on Monday. There is a consensus on sort of basic terms like liberty and equality, but actually when you dig down deep, people actually don't agree about what liberty means, about what equality means, and other types of things. And if we think about how this applies to modern problems and the contemporary issues that are facing the United States, what we see is that these differences are not only legion, but they're also pitting people against each other in really pernicious ways. So as a scholar of race, ethnicity, and politics, one of the things that I always think about is what is racism? And we've known since the end of the civil rights movement that there is a consensus on basic interpersonal forms of racism that are no longer socially acceptable, or at least weren't before Donald Trump became president of the United States. But there's a lot of disagreement about systemic racism, and there isn't a consensus. So 5 years ago, I did a survey where I asked people, what's racist? Most people, even Trump voters, agreed that you shouldn't call people racial slurs, you shouldn't commit hate crimes against people, segregation is bad. But then when you started to talk about other structural issues like, putting landfills in poor communities that are disproportionately minority, is that racist? People don't agree on that. They don't recognize always the things that are systemic, the things that are subtle, the things that aren't obvious and in your face, the things that could be sort of handled in a race neutral fashion and carried on by the state that aren't involving somebody walking up to somebody and slapping them across the face because of the color of their skin or some other type of, identifiable trait that makes them different. So we have to come together to figure out how to agree on the terms. The other thing, I would be remiss as an Emory faculty member if I didn't give a shout out to my now retired colleague, Alan Abramowitz, and talk about the notion of negative partisanship. And I think that that really is explaining a lot of what's going on right now in the United States. And so this idea of negative partisanship is the idea that people define their partisan identity in particular, but also just their broader political identity as the antithesis of what they disagree with. So you know that if you don't support abortion, if you are more socially conservative, if you don't want an expanded welfare state, then that helps to define you as a Republican, not necessarily that you believe in limited government, that you believe in a strong national defense, or even that you like Ronald Reagan or some other historical figure that's associated with the Republican Party. Instead, you're deciding that you're not the other, and sort of defining yourself against the other is what is helping to influence your partisan identity. And we see that actually coming through in terms of the gamesmanship that we see amongst elites, but also that we see in public discourse, where people are willing to cut off their nose to spite their face if the other side actually makes a proposal. So you have to oppose masks if the people on the other political party are the ones telling you that you need to be the one to wear a mask or to get a vaccine. Or you can forget all of the ways that you contributed to the mess in Kabul by saying, well, this happened on this particular president's watch, so therefore, I'm just going to ask that you quit, right? Because clearly I want my other side to be able to gain some ground in this particular game. So I think all of these things are related, and they just really underscore the ways in which we are much more divided than we are united. And I think we have a lot of work to do in order to forge a more perfect union and actually even make up some of the ground that I think we had in previous decades.
Nice.
Great. Thank you very much, Andra. Jacob.
Great. Well, first of all, I'm really pleased to be part of this. I feel like speaking to a European audience about American politics is a bit like explaining like reality TV to somebody who doesn't understand TV or reality for that matter. So I hope that you guys will find something of value in what I have to say. And I will mention a few ways where I think the US situation is actually pretty different from that we see in other rich democracies. So Andra summed up the problem as polarization. I'm going to sum up the problem as asymmetric polarization, by which I mean that the Republican Party has gone much farther toward the extremes than the Democratic Party. And I also mean the asymmetric effect of polarization on each party's capacity to win elections and govern effectively. So let me unpack that. Paul Pearson and I have been doing work on the Republican Party since 2005, and Paul at one point took a picture of a bumper sticker he saw in Berkeley that he said is just sort of like a summary of three or four of our books, and it was GOP, OMG, WTF. And so why are we saying GOP, OMG, WTF? Well, one is that, as everyone knows, and as Andra talked about, the party has become essentially a right-wing ethno-nationalist backlash party and anti-system party as well. I'll unpack that a little bit more in a second. But at the same time, unlike such parties abroad, it's not a welfare chauvinist party. It doesn't want to shovel money to its constituents. Instead, it's focused on helping out the richest of the rich and at least some big parts of the corporate world. In a word, it's committed to plutocracy. So Paul and I have called the Republican Party a plutocratic populist party, to distinguish it from the sort of traditional ethno-nationalist populist party. Now, I recognize there are strains of this around the world. It's pretty rare in rich democracies. It's not nearly as plutocratic as it is here. And it's been pretty plutocratic even under Trump, which I think is important to keep in mind in terms of what Republicans actually did when they had power, which wasn't a lot, but what they did was very focused on shoveling money to rich people. And then the third point I made about the asymmetric effect. So it's one thing to have a coalition that's running toward the extremes. It's another to have a coalition that is doing that and has huge institutional advantages built into the American political system. And You guys know these, but they're really distinctive. So the non-urban electorate is vastly overweighted in the Senate. It's the most malapportioned upper house in the rich world. Even the House, as Jonathan Rodden has convincingly argued, is very weighted towards non-urban places. This didn't matter when the Republican Party was not a party that drew from a more rural base, but now it does. And of course, some of this carries over the Electoral College as well. And the Republicans have used this advantage quite effectively to stack the other institutions of government, especially to rig the electoral system through voter restrictions at the state level, and to stack the courts. It is a striking thing that in an era in which Republicans have literally not won the popular vote for the presidency more than once since George H.W. Bush, they've managed to get a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And then finally, when I said the asymmetric effects, I just want to mention one thing that I think is really fundamental. So the Republicans haven't been able to achieve a lot of their goals, but one of their main goals is just stopping stuff from happening. And their institutional advantages, coupled with the increasing polarization that Andra talked about, have come together with the fact that our system is pretty status quo biased. It's even more so than it used to be due to the filibuster's increasing use. And that has been very advantageous to the party. And so I think we'll talk about reforms, but I think we have to understand that the problem of polarization is really one of an asymmetric polarization that both advantages the Republican Party and allows it to entrench itself within our distinctive institutional structure.
Thank you, Jacob. Right on time. Thank you. Ursula.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. And thank you very much for including me in this panel. I'm delighted to be here amongst such esteemed colleagues. And I think what I'm going to say is going to dovetail very nicely with what Andra and Jacob have set out for us. But I wanted to draw us back a little bit and think when I first received this question, we thought about this, what are the biggest challenges facing American democracy? And I was thinking, challenge, that's sort of sounds like a really invigorating outdoor pursuit, you know, like a sort of pleasurable, exciting test of your character, something that you would engage in and become stronger and better through going through that challenge, you know, the Three Peaks challenge, the ice bucket challenge. I'm sort of I don't think necessarily that is the terminology that I would like to use, because I think that when we talk about a challenge, that maybe creates a sense of complacency. It implies that full democracy has been a norm in American history, and that the threats it faces are easily remedied. And I think that we would, all of us perhaps on this panel, like to push back against those assumptions. And I think, as Jacob already mentioned, we have a system here that is not especially democratic in the first place. You've got all these veto points that block social change that is desired by mass publics, majorities of mass publics. You've got the most malapportioned upper house in the world that's becoming still more egregiously malapportioned, of course, over time because of population shifts. You've got the filibuster, you've got the Electoral College, you've got many episodes, of course, in American history of backsliding and of crisis, of course, most famously, the disenfranchisement of millions of African Americans in the last decades of the 19th century. So I don't think we mustn't be complacent, but I think also we need to be quite careful not to become so apocalyptic in our vision of American democracy and the threats it faces that we are not clear-eyed about some of the real advances that have occurred in the past. So in particular, of course, Reconstruction, the flowering of electoral democracy in the South, the rising middle classes in the aftermath of World War II, sort of more Americans participating in public life, Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the sort of forceful backing of African Americans' civil rights at that time. So I don't want to suggest that the United States is the threat is to descend into outright tyranny or anarchy or war or the cancellation of elections, but it's more about these, and this is where it dovetails, I think, nicely with what Andra has to say, the sort of subtler but powerful ways in which the rule of law and of elections are undermined. And by forces, that some of which have already been identified by my fellow panelists, of course, polarization in particular, that is asymmetrical and is affective in quality, but also the resurgence of racism and white supremacism and nativism, economic inequality, I should mention, excessive executive power, and I think Des might well have something to say about this. There's a wonderful book recently on that subject, geographical segregation, the conservative media, and the growth of money in politics. And I think all of these things, if I were to have to give a single answer to this question about the threats facing American democracy, it would be to think in terms of a sense of complacency about the normal running of the system, that I think we need to be quite careful about to critique. The failure to defend constitutional rights, particularly for African Americans, the assumption that checks and balances is always a good thing for democracy, the failure to prevent unscrupulous actors for using those institutions for personal gain, and the failure to mitigate rising economic inequality through public policy. So if I had one point that I would like to put across, it's that I think subtler undermining of democracy is often more insidious and dangerous than full frontal assaults. Again, Andra's prefigured some of these points, but just that because the latter provokes a backlash, it often provokes a backlash. It's not so much the excesses of the Trump administration per se, it's the failure of Republicans to oppose him and to hold him to account, and for those institutions to prevent him for him not to be enabled to do what he was able to do. So I think it's harder to combat developments that are indirect, where cynical actors have the sort of advantage of plausible deniability. I've done some work on this at the state level. Where people are distracted and misinformed, where institutions have been undermined in ways that prevent them from mounting a robust response to threats to democracy. So I think when you layer all of these developments, whether that's the rise of dark money, whether that's the rise of misinformation on social media, whether that's a sort of geographical and economic and partisan polarization and sorting and segregation that sorts people into different camps so that they fail to, there isn't really a sense of any more of shared political reality. Once you layer all of that onto a system that is already vulnerable to backsliding and that is not fully democratic in the first place, that is, I think, the true threat and the true danger here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Ursula. Des.
Hi, thanks very much. Very nice to be with everybody. Since the Americans are keeping us out from traveling to APSA, to have a chance to have a mini one here to meet colleagues. So I've got several challenges. In one sense, but I do want to start with a paradox, because I think there's a question about deep functionality or deep dysfunctionality about the US system at the moment. With the question how well this political system can cope with deep problems. And the answer, I think, can either be, if you're sort of somebody who's optimistic and sanguine, will say, well, they've always had problems and it's always adapted and it carries on. And here we are, we're still talking about it, but actually somebody will say something was worse 100 years ago than it is now, which I doubt. If you're a realist, intelligent pessimist like me, then you'll say it's really reached a bad time. It's a bit of a crisis that's of a deeper nature than previously. But nonetheless, the problems that it faces stem from its origins, both in 1619 and in the 1770s. And the first one, I think, is obviously the ideological material dimension of inequality, of racial inequality. The state's ideology persists in being insufficiently capacious to accept the depth of inequality built into the system that was constitutive of the US. And this is a recurring issue. It's certainly surprised people like myself and Roger Smith, who's written about this a lot, how much it has exploded and got worse in the last decade, really. I think the 2010s we're going to look back on them historically at this moment, when what I would call white protectionism rather than ethno-nationalism arose and consolidated, and groups that we thought didn't exist and were only latent at worst are really quite significant and powerful. And we've done a piece, what we've sort of reformulated our argument to say there is now a fundamental, the polarization that Andrea talked about and Jacob talked about and so forth, is one between white protectionists and a sort of what we call racial reparations order, which is a broad umbrella term, but really divided on racialization in America. There's a second problem with, and it's related to this core fundamental problem that I've talked about, which I think shapes everything. Second problem is, I think, judicial legitimacy, which both Ursula and Jacob touched on. And this is something which is very hard, I think, for American voters, less so perhaps for scholars, but to grasp and to understand, because everybody says, well, at least we have the Supreme Court. You know, that's a great institution and so forth. And it just, I've argued for a very long time, since I've had to teach this to undergraduates for over 30 years, or 35 years, that it's an ideological institution. And that the notion that it's an impartial upholder of the law is just nonsense. In the area I'm most interested in, civil rights, it's been the major agent for diluting civil rights since the 1980s. Remarkable. You probably can find only one positive decision since the 1980s by the court in respect to civil rights in respect to, particularly to African Americans. And you can find a whole host of them diluting it. And of course, it operates this way in other areas, which I just got the update from New York Times about its decision today on Roe versus Wade, which is going to be very, very, very interesting. I mean, not directly on Roe versus Wade, but on indirectly by allowing the new Texas law to carry on. This was brought home to me. All of this was brought home to me this week by an interview with Stephen Breyer, one of the justices in the New York Times, where he said two things which are very striking. One is that he didn't want. He's 83. He's the oldest judge. He needs to go. And he said he didn't want to go and have someone reversing all his decisions for the last 25 years. So that immediately tells you something about the court, that it's not just a neutral jurisprudential institution. It's actually an ideological institution with justices trying to push an agenda. And the other thing is, he said that the court is so important. He said as a weapon against tyranny, autocracy, and irrationality. And I don't see it that way. I think it's become an institution which is wholly ideological in its basis. I'm going to finish very quickly, Stephen, just two things. One is, Ursula was kind enough to refer to this book I've done with Stephen Skowronek called Phantoms of a Beleaguered Republic, in which we talk about the problem of institutional paralysis, and particularly the erosion of bureaucratic legitimacy and expertise as presidential power has increased. Congress looks quite infirm. Partly it's to do with the polarization with which Andra began, but it's also very significant on that basis. And finally, there is also a looming massive short-term challenge, and that is the role of the Federal Reserve, which is a technical and complex issue. But the Federal Reserve is, as you know, the most powerful central bank in the world, and it is responsible for managing monetary policy. It's independent, and the question is complex, and we could talk about this, but it's highly relevant at the moment politically, because Congress is considering whether Powell will be reappointed, and there's a lot of lobbying to get rid of the chairman of it. The question really is whether the Fed continuing to buy Treasury bonds is going to work, and whether this monetization of the economy can go on indefinitely, and whether it can be withdrawn from easily and effectively. I think it's going to be very hard, and we could well be in for a very substantial economic shock. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Des. Jim.
Great. Like everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure to be here with these panelists, all of whom are older new friends. I think American democracy is in peril. I would stipulate what everyone has said, exactly right. And I would add one thing, that if you're not steeped in American politics, we are stuck with two parties, and that will not change. So a question I often get from European audiences, might there be a third party? No, never, not gonna happen. We can talk about that in the Q&A. So there's very distinctive features about American politics per se, as we struggle with things that many countries are struggling with, as we all try to preserve our democracy. And in the United States, it's really quite in peril, I think, as that pessimist that went before me just so clearly articulated. I want to focus on a distinctive American feature to all this, or several, but the most important is the unprecedented tribal politics we're in and why. The United States has always had a white supremacy party, all the way back. And the racial clashes, anybody who's studied American politics for 7 minutes knows how deep the racial politics goes. It has always generally had a nativist party. And if you've studied American politics a lot longer, you'll know about one eruption after another as Americans ask the question, who are we? And many people say, not them, insert latest group to arrive. What is very interesting about the American past is those two parties have never been the same. The white supremacy party and the we hate immigrants party has never been the same party. There are times when this gets complicated by factions, but take that as a general rule of American politics. You can go back from election to election, all the way back to the first contested election in 1800, and what you'll find is one party, more or less, by the standards of the day, champions African Americans and racial justice, put it in quotes. In 1800, it was a very shaky justice indeed, while the other party really wants to preserve white supremacy and before that slavery, but that same other party embracing immigrants. What happened across the last 75 years, slowly but gathering velocity, is something unprecedented. Beginning in 1933 and going on to 1964, African Americans migrated from the Conservative Party, the Republicans, to the Democrats. And one by one, immigrant groups did likewise, migrating sometimes from the Republican Party, sometimes they were already Democrats. Asian Americans were the last to join the Democratic Party, one of the few groups to vote for George Herbert Walker Bush over Bill Clinton, but after that, starting in 2000, becoming heavily Democratic for various reasons, until by the year 2000, what was emerging was a Democratic Party that had all the quote unquote so-called minorities, and a Republican Party that was the party of white nativists. If you, that is a new kind of clash. And I think it's given a particular intensity to our politics. If you look in the past, racial politics was intense, immigrant politics was intense, but they weren't both intense the same way across parties, or to put it slightly differently, parties didn't mainline the culture wars right into our politics. Starting in 2002 and gathering velocity, quite right about 2010s, that began to happen, or it happened more and more. And that gives a real intensity to our politics. If you watch the great flagship of conservative news, Fox News, the one thing people haven't commented on, but I spent some time watching it every day or seeing it online every day, you will always find an attack of Black African Americans on some innocent whites. It's often curated, twisted, going back in history, made up, but the constant threat of, oh my gosh, we're under assault from those people creates a special intensity about this culture war. Let me finish with two quick points that intensifies all this. The 2000 election, the 2000 census, when people ran the numbers, came across something unprecedented, and that is that the United States was turning into a minority of people who considered themselves white natives. That is, was becoming majority minority. So first you have the parties creating this culture war, and then suddenly you have the announcement, whether right or wrong, that it was going to become the United States a minority nation, giving intense power to this culture war. And then I'll only refer to the third point because I'm out of time. And that is to say, as Jacob has written with great passion, we have no rules for voting. And so that is part of politics every time. Donald Trump only showed the latest example of how these rules are up for political grabs. And so combine the parties for the first time really summarizing our culture wars in an era where the dominant ethnic group fears that it will become a minority within a generation, and no voting rules, and you have a recipe for burying your democracy in an effort to preserve this shrinking form of majority and increasing minority. That will explain an awful lot of American politics. Last statement, when the whites were in a clear majority, 90% of the country was white, the Republicans were winning by vast margins. The Democrats could count on not one state, there are 50 of them, not one state between 1968 and 1992. Now, as the white population shrinks, as several of you have pointed out, the Republicans have no hope of winning general popular elections and have to find ways to squeeze the election and use the bias rules. So in a word, unprecedented racial tribalism in our parties on top of a rickety system during a moment of ethnic transformation. Recipe for trouble.
Okay, Jim, thanks very much for those excellent comments. And thanks for all the panelists for their excellent comments. And you've identified very serious problems, I think, facing American democracy. And I've asked all the panelists to think about, well, is there any hope? How do we move forward? We as political scientists are trained to think about how we can promote democracy. What do the panelists recommend in terms of how we move forward to improve the very serious situation that we find ourselves in? So I'll give each of the panelists 5 minutes, and then I'll open up for questions from the audience. So, Andra.
So I am always optimistic. That's informed by faith. The political scientist in me realizes that we're in for a really rough time for the near term. And so I don't see any signs of this. I've had this debate about whether or not you can describe American democracy or the problems facing it as a virus or as cancer. So it's hard sometimes. So usually, people want to talk about the cancer as metastasized. And I do think that that's actually a pretty apt analogy. I kind of like the viral one. I don't think our fever has broken yet. And I have sometimes, really dire, sour, very pessimistic ways about how I think that it's broken, but I don't want it to go that, because I think that those will actually be really traumatic and really destabilizing. But there are some things that, I think we can do and hopefully work towards. And I think sort of we as scholars can actually help to promote these things. So one, I mentioned that, we are encountering a problem with diversity. I think diversity is a good thing. So, there could be the solution of, well, let's, make the country less diverse so we could close off our borders. You could have, whites, and there are movements in the United States to encourage people to have more children, to sort of, reflect that imbalance. I don't want to propose any of that. Like that I don't think that's feasible. I don't think that it makes sense. And I think we have to learn to embrace diversity and live with it and understand how to get along with people who are different from ourselves, but are yet united around a common purpose. So to that end, what I'd like to do is figure out how we can get people to agree on basic terms. I don't expect that, we're going to resolve the problem of, whether or not you agree in equality of opportunity versus equality of result, or some combination of the two. I don't think we can reconcile those whose view of liberty is more libertarian in their perspective versus those who, have a more positive view of liberty. But I do think that there are some basic historic facts that our education system can actually try to eradicate. So I live in a state where, within recent memory, I have to check, this person might actually still hold a state legislative seat, where, we have legislators who elected people who are high school teachers who will teach that slavery wasn't the cause of the Civil War, right? This is something that the overwhelming majority of his professional historians agree is the case. And if you don't believe me, just go look at the secession documents of all the states who would very explicitly say that this is why they're leaving. And I tell you this as somebody who grew up, 15 minutes away from the Confederate White House, the last one anyway. So there is this huge debate where people are still having this discussion, and it's manifesting itself in terms of, you know, debates about whether we should remove Confederate monuments. There is a discussion about privilege that is being discussed right now as we're seeing discussions of critical race theory be contested. And the irony of it is that in most elementary, middle, and high schools in the United States, people are not talking about critical race theory. Like your 15-year-old isn't reading Kimberly Crenshaw. So the fact that we are even having this discussion sort of shows how contested this is, but we're going to have that discussion, and we're going to have to live with the discomfort. And we're going to have to get people educationally on the same page so that we do sort of recognize that certain things did happen in history. They were bad and they have consequences. It might not change people's minds about certain groups. It might not build their affect or their affinity for groups, but we need to make sure that that happens. The thing that I think about when I think about sort of polarization, even in an asymmetric sense, and partisanship, you know, one of the things that this is a manifestation of is a manifestation of ideological sorting, which on the one hand shows a certain logical consistency that didn't exist in American politics in the mid-20th century. So there were people who were actually going against some of their interests because they had regional ties, or sometimes because they had certain racial ties in terms of how they were identifying, you know, politically in terms of what their partisan orientation is. And so part of the reason why we are so polarized today is that the parties are not as big tent as they used to be. So there aren't liberal Republicans in the Republican coalition who are there to sort of, you know, be a bulwark against sort of right-wing fringe conspiracy theories and craziness. And we do also see the same phenomenon on the Democratic side. It's less pronounced, as Jacob mentioned, on the Democratic side, in part because of racial and ethnic minorities, particularly African Americans. So African Americans, even those who are conservative, usually don't join the Republican Party because they view that party as the party of racism. And they view that as actually being inimical to some of their most existential interests. So if the Republican Party ever changed their attitude about race and became less white supremacist, there's a chance that we would see more heterogeneity in African American voting behavior than we see. It works to a lesser degree for Hispanics and Asian Americans. I mean, we see a little bit more ideological sorting. That in part explains why Donald Trump actually did so well amongst Latino voters in the 2020 election. So, you know, if we didn't have this level of sorting that we see amongst white voters, we probably wouldn't have the same type of rabid, hyper-partisan environment that we have. So, you know, I'm at a quandary, right? Do I want people to kind of be illogical and not be sort of terribly ill-informed or terribly informed or coherent? I'm not sure, but I do realize that people actually being a little bit more consistent is actually having really, really negative consequences for sort of how our politics are being expressed today. So I don't know if I have many answers other than I think education will at least help sort of set the facts straight. But that's actually really hard to do in an environment when, as Jim has pointed out, there is not just Fox, there are two other new networks that like repeatedly lie every day and are feeding misinformation that's actually really hard on the ground to overcome and to dispel.
Okay, thank you, Andra. Jacob.
Great. Well, I want to hear from those who are on the other side of this conversation, so I'll keep this really brief. And I'll just say that I have two kind of obvious prescriptions and one that I hope is less obvious. So the first is, you know, pass serious institutional electoral reform. That's kind of the number one thing that has to happen, not because this is all about our screwed up institutions and electoral system, but because they're amenable to change. Now, we've all been, in the US at least, hearing about what might be done to reduce gerrymandering, to ensure a guaranteed right to vote, make it a lot easier for people to exercise that right, and a little bit about reducing the sway of money, which is actually really hard to do. But I will just note that what would make passing this such a change possible is also an important change in itself, which would be eliminating the filibuster and making the federal government, in the easiest way possible, more majoritarian. And I think that has a couple pretty obvious benefits. One is that the filibuster is just basically another pro-GOP, white, pro-non-urban bias in the system, because it adds on top of the Senate a further skew, so that, you know, in theory, 10% of the population, or senators representing 10% of the population or so, can stop things from happening. It's just crazy. And we have this, and it's also a lot more beneficial, as I said, to the Republican Party, which is increasingly a minoritarian party and has long been a party more interested in making government dysfunctional than making government work. The other thing that's kind of obvious is do a few big things that help people. Now, that's easier than you might think in the current context, because we have such an unequal economy in the United States, but you could take a little bit from the super rich and corporations and give a lot to ordinary workers and their families across class lines and across racial lines. And I think that's kind of what, you know, the Biden administration has been trying to do. I think it has to be something pretty concrete and specific. You know, paid leave is better than infrastructure for that. Something that people will see in their lives and link to the federal government and link to the Democratic Party. We still might see the Democrats get clobbered in 2022, but this is the best, I think, recipe for the future. So what's the unconventional prescription? Well, I think right now there's a really great opportunity to cleave a lot of the business community away from the Republican Party. It's ironically the case that I think the right wing, the Republicans would be a somewhat more dangerous, but a lot less powerful party if they were just a right-wing populist party and not a plutocratic party as well. People talk about the business break with the Republicans. It's not yet happened to the extent that you might think, but it actually could happen for a variety of reasons that I am happy to discuss in the Q&A. I'm not talking about all corporate America siding with Democrats or much less progressives, but I'm talking about them being less supportive of the Republican Party, and in particular that if a divided capitalist class, if you will, is going to be a less powerful influence on our politics.
Okay, thank you very much, Jacob. Ursula.
Thanks, Steve. What I'm going to say is going to add, I think, very much to what my fellow panelists have been describing. And I mean, you know, when you think about the question of what we can actually do, what can actually be done about the system, there are three categories in my mind. I mean, one of them is things that are just baked into the system that are just pretty difficult to change. It's other things that are extremely difficult, and some things that are just very difficult. So, I mean, I think the general sense is that this is a very, very difficult question. And in general, I mean, I think that the need to restore the rule of law, the need to shore up the integrity of elections, the need to decrease levels of partisan and racial polarization, as Andra is describing, and reduce economic inequality and reassert Congress's role in checking and overseeing the presidency. So a short list of requirements. I think I agree with Jacob, of course, that reform of the filibuster is a must, but I would say also the need for a constitutional amendment to address the extreme malapportionment of the Senate by expanding its membership, the National Popular Vote Compact, instead of the Electoral College that's currently got 195 electoral votes on board, 16 signatories. It would need, of course, 270 for it to go into effect. There's sort of absolutely glacial progress on that front. The need, as Jacob mentioned, to renew commitment to democracy and to elections and to vote the Voting Rights Act. I mean, of course, there's the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which the House, which would reinstate federal pre-clearance and would strengthen the court's role in overseeing elections, but of course isn't going to get past the Senate and that filibuster. So that's an impossible hurdle, basically. But so there are all sorts of things that are just extremely, extremely difficult to do anything about. But I don't think it's just about constitutional amendments. I think it's also about addressing the sort of social and economic underpinnings of some of the malaise that we have been describing on this panel. I think there's a question here about economic redistribution, of the need for elites to act in a sort of bipartisan way to signal to their tribe, to their party, that it's okay to work with the other side. That's something that can be, it's very, very difficult, but it can be done criticizing one's own side can be very powerful, I think, in intervening in this question of affective polarization and of polarization more generally. Finding that common ground wherever possible, addressing segregation in schools and in neighborhoods, which I think can only occur through forceful federal action, and providing a lot of information to correct misinformation and stereotypes the other side. But I think what we know from the literature on things like the submerged state is that you need a lot of that information. It's really, really difficult to correct misinformation. Of course, Andra described some of the, and Jim have also described some of the difficulties of combating some of the misinformation that we see in the media. So I think just to sort of dovetail with some of the concerns that I raised, or what I thought of as the biggest threat to American democracy, it's that question of complacency about the ability of the system to regenerate itself, and also of the subtle ways in which these norms can be undermined from within, rather than necessarily the full frontal assault, but these subtler ways in which you can undermine democratic norms. And I think that that it's a very, very difficult thing to try to respond to those the ways in which these norms have been undermined. I think that it's partly a question of deliberation, and I think there are some encouraging field experiments that political scientists have fielded to suggest that deliberation, if it's done right, can reduce levels of polarization, of affective polarization, foster understanding, increase trust. I think that there's a question there about deliberateness and a forceful federal action. I mean, Jacob mentioned, I mean, just can we help people? I mean, this is the thing, and for that help to be attributed correctly to the government, and thereby foster trust in what that system is doing. And that, I think, is very difficult to do in a system that has become so the difficulty of achieving pretty much anything legislatively at the federal level means that, first of all, the action shifts partly to the states, which of course are overwhelmingly supported by controlled by trifecta Republicans, and there are some Democratic trifectas, but Republicans are disproportionately represented at the state level. So it pushes action to the states, but it also pushes federal policymakers to try to legislate in indirect ways, in ways that will allow them to still achieve some of their aims, maybe through things like tax expenditures, through privatized delivery modes. The problem there, of course, is that it's much less clear to the average voter that the government is responsible for that particular policy, and the sort of the upwardly redistributive consequences of those policies are not obvious to people, and so that fuels organized interest, and it becomes more and more difficult. There's a larger and larger gap, informational asymmetries between the mass public and the elites that I think is corrosive in these subtle ways of democracy. And so what some of the experiments in this field have shown is that you can try to deal with those that corrosion of trust and the lack of due focus upon what the government actually has done for the average person by providing lots of information. But also it's a question of policy entrepreneurs saying, right, we're going to try to legislate more directly. We're going to try not to, even if it's tempting and even if it helps our lower income constituencies, perhaps on the Democratic side, we're going to try to legislate in a way that makes it more obvious what the government is doing, and allows us to foster that sort of trust. And so I think that kind of openness and deliberation and deliberateness, those are the sort of in general, the sorts of things that need to be encouraged. I think when it comes down to the specifics, it's really, really tough. It's really, really tough. I think that it's going to require incremental efforts by policy entrepreneurs to try to make some small differences where they can within a system that is not conducive to that sort of change, and that is very vulnerable and facing many threats. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ursula. Des.
Thanks very much. I'm going to probably build quite a lot on what the others have said already. I mean, the deep issues arise from the way the Constitution has designed the system and the way it's developed over the years. So we sort of need constitutional amendment reform, and I don't see that happening that quickly. There is one thing that we might, one issue that we might note on that. what interests me is in some ways, how has reform been achieved in the past, and what do you need for it? So if you ask the question, how was the Voting Rights Act implemented, let alone we get through Congress, but actually implemented, you discover it required a massive federal effort. Thousands and thousands of federal monitors were hired, civil servants effectively, and trained. And they went and stood at the registration offices for the elections, before elections, and then they stood on the day of elections to stop intimidation and physical abuse towards those who had previously been disenfranchised, who were now supposed to have the right to vote. Far from a flawless system, it took a long time, and they didn't do every state. They didn't go to Mississippi. They were too scared of going there. But they did other states, and we had gradual progress on that basis. And I think if the Lewis Act bill was to become a law, the same questions would come up again about how you enforce it. And the lesson I've taken from this is about the need for federal power to be mobilized if you're going to make substantial change on this basis. And the issues that Ursula just referred to of segregation and so forth are untouched because they haven't had that sort of federal attention. Interestingly, the brilliant book by Matthew Desmond, which some of you may have seen the last 2 years, called Evicted, it's a fantastic study, ethnographic and political economy study of the rental market in the United States, case study of Milwaukee for the most part. He ends up there asking what should be done, and his argument is that the one measure that has worked really well are federal housing assistance, and that's the area. So not doing it at the state level, not doing it at the local level, but doing it at the federal level. And I thought he made a very persuasive case about that. There is now a bubbling up issue about reparations in the US. And there are little local initiatives about this, and there are important university initiatives, in addition to all the memorialization debate about buildings and getting rid of hideous statues and so forth. There's the question of material obligations and debts. And that's been an issue for a long time. There's a big literature on it. It's an issue, but it's come onto the agenda in some sort of serious way. And that has to be done at the federal level through federal enactment. So one thing, so for me, it's federal power. Now, this is anathema, obviously, to small state Republicans, though there aren't really small state Republicans anymore because they use the state the ways they want, but the ideology of being a small state Republican and the ideology of being an individualist and so forth is wholly against this. The reality is, if you care about equality and civil rights, it's never happened in the absence of significant federal engagement. Second area for reform, I think, is the court. I would instantly end the life tenure of justices, maybe make it 2 7-year terms or something quite similar to the Federal Reserve at the moment, not for the chairman, but for the board members. I would certainly try to ensure that the court had to have some better explanation of the decision making it's taking, because to say it's jurisprudence is just not satisfactory. It's just not accurate. Everyone says at the moment we have 5-4 division for close to 2 decades. We now have a 6-3. I know it doesn't happen in every case, but on most of the most significant cases to do with the issues that everybody on the panel has been talking about, it falls on a very crude ideological line. And President Biden has set up a big commission to investigate this with eminent jurists, including some of our colleagues in political science and law schools. I imagine it'll make a very worthy report, which will disappear and not happen. But I hope that somebody may pick up on this and lobby and say this really needs to be done, because the rule of law, which is held up as a great principle, so forth, doesn't work for a lot of people in the United States. It's been used against them, and that's why it's very important. So those are the two things. I think they're both quite difficult, but I think more targeted federal engagement and some serious judicial review. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Des. Jim.
One little tiny ray of hope on all this is to look at young people. They are very, very different political creatures than old people. They're a very diverse generation. And I mean millennials, people under 35 basically, and so-called Gen Zers, the younger yet. They are not Republicans. What the Republican Party is selling is by and large about 2-to-1, if I'm reading the polls correctly, and in many cases more than 2-to-1, anathema to this generation. So what you have, if you dive down into the generational divides of American politics, is older people clinging on to many of the conservative things that have been referred to here, and younger people who want no part of it. Socialism in America has been dumbed down so that just about any country in Europe would count. And most young people take a look and say, gee, that sounds pretty good to me. And so they call themselves socialists. So we're entering slowly, certainly, but surely into an era when more and more of the voters coming online want less and less to do with these cultural wars. Watch that space because it's going to change things. And unless we lose our popular system, our popular electoral system altogether, and that's a possibility, the younger generation is going to change it in profound ways, I believe. Second, that raises, I think, the most important question for the American future, and that's what will become of the Republican Party. This is a conversation almost no one on the panel will really be privy to. But Republicans themselves have a basic choice, and this really picks up on what Andra said to kick off this particular round. They have a choice between conservative values, the values of liberty and so forth that several people have noted that seems to have slipped away from that party. But if you're a Republican or a conservative listening to this, you'd say, well, I'm not. I don't feel in any way that I'm part of a white privilege party. My party is a party of freedom, of liberty, of small government, and there is that strain in the Republican Party. I think the young Republicans I know are very keen to resuscitate that not very healthy piece of republicanism. And there's the other strain, the white nativist privileged culture war that we've all talked about, that I talked about earlier. That has always given this Republican coalition, right back to the mid-60s, their juice, not just back to the 60s, right through time. And the Republicans face a fundamental choice, whether they're going to in some way exercise that very powerful but pernicious aspect of their party in order to preserve what really has been very useful, very powerful, philosophically powerful in their history. And it's a really fundamental choice. And I think a lot of American politics, future politics relies on that. And the reason I think the Republicans might do what I would consider the right thing is you look at young voters, you want to win those, you better start going after some of the groups that you used to speak to, conservative African Americans, conservative Latinos, conservative Asians, and try to win them back. Exactly as Andra said a little while ago, it's a fundamental choice Republicans have to make. Democrats have their own choice, of course, and that's the choice between being the party of the working class, which shockingly they no longer are, and beginning to go back to some of the ideas of Truman and Roosevelt, the real idea that we stand up for people who need help in this era of inequality, or whether they start pursuing the party of wealth, whether they try to also be part of the capitalist class. There are both those strains in the Democratic Party. One final thing to say, other people in the party have spoken just now forcefully for institutional reform. I I underline all those suggestions. They're all very important. And what you have to understand if you don't know much about American politics is just how anti-democratic our institutions are, to the point, as I implied earlier, that we don't even agree on how you count the vote. That's a political thing in the United States. We've got to clean up the institutional acts. Lots of good ideas. Let me just toss one last one on the table. Make voting mandatory. Just start a crusade. It's now starting, I hope. Let me sound the trumpet. Americans should call out to Australians, Belgium, a few others, Brazil, require all Americans to vote, and lots of other things will fall into place, particularly given what I've said about young voters. And once again, thanks to all of you.
Okay, Jim, thanks so much for your comments. And so I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. Jacob Hacker had to leave for another obligation, and so we thank him for his comments as well. So please post your questions in the chat. I see that David Farrell has already posted one question in the chat, and I pose that to the panel. You know, what are the kind of party strategic options that Democrats could or should consider? Anybody on the panel want to take that one?
So, I mean, I think one of the challenges that the Democratic Party faces, I mean, Jim alluded to some of the strategic choices that the Democrats have got in the coming up in the future. But so I won't overlap with what he said. But what I would suggest is that it is a bit of a dilemma for the Democrats to decide how they're going to respond, and in particular whether they're going to take advantage of some of the developments that are corrosive of democracy, but which can, in some circumstances, be helpful to them in terms of their political fortunes. I'm thinking in particular here about the rise of small donors and in terms of bankrolling democratic efforts, but in particular of Citizens United and the rise after 2010, after that decision, of the increase in the amount of money that's in politics. It's not. What's interesting is it's not primarily the corporation money that rises, the amount of the money that businesses are able to inject into politics, so much as the big increase comes with the unions and with the amount of money that they are able to actually place into politics. And so, I mean, it's not to say that corporations don't spend a great deal of money on American politics. That's absolutely clear. But it's the unions that are actually enabled by that decision to increase the amounts that they are spending, and so that has political advantages for the Democrats. And also, I think I would suggest that some of the rule changes that enable partisan consideration of judicial nominees in Congress, for instance, that were instigated by Democrats and rather than the Republicans in the first instance, because it suited their short-term objectives. The pursuit also of policymaking that through tax expenditures for working class families that does have broadly redistributive effects. All of these things can seem great for Democrats, at least in the short to medium term, but the overwhelming effect in the sort of medium to longer term is that they have the effect of reducing trust, of damaging subtly the sort of pillars of American democracy. And so I think there is I simply seek to sharpen that dilemma that there was identified in the question there, that Democrats need to be very careful about how they play this, because there could be some short-term strategic wins that are actually long-term disadvantageous for democracy, but also for them, Democrats, capital D, as well.
And just to add to that, several people have made suggestions, I think, that are very useful. All the institutional suggestions of ending the filibuster, changing the court. Essentially, what the United States needs to do, and people have made suggestions throughout this panel, is emphasize majority rules. And insofar as you can do that, we'll come a long way to at least addressing some of these problems. And let me just say, it's been really quite successful simply to push reforms. Ending the filibuster, for example, simply calling for an end to the filibuster, I believe helped bring Republicans around on a infrastructure bill because they want to be able to say, don't end the filibuster. See, we're voting for something. I don't think without the threat of ending the filibuster, you would have gotten a vote. We may still not get it, but there are indications that the Democrats and Republicans will actually come together to pass through an infrastructure bill, precisely because there's the threat of reform. And likewise, Des's call for judicial reform, simply calling for an end to these long, lifelong terms, I believe will, while not fixing the problem, simply calling for the reform may moderate some of these effects. But the answer really lies, political scientists will love this, in institutional reforms that tend back away from minority rules, which now dominate the American system.
And I think as the behavioralist, I think there are some strategic considerations that Democratic candidates need to make. So, you know, part of the logic around progressive Democratic politics is that they should be unabashedly Democratic, and that will actually attract more people than trying to go after elusive people who are in the middle. And on the one hand, the logic of that is that whites who wanted to defect to the Republican Party have, and they're not coming back, so it doesn't make any sense to pursue them. On the other hand, it is important to acknowledge the ideological heterogeneity within the party and the need in order to be able to have a majority of seats, for instance, in the House of Representatives, to respect the needs and the policy positions of those who will not necessarily align with the squad. So we were starting to see an evolution of this in part because we are seeing far left Democrats lose in key primaries this year. But you know, the idea that you don't attack somebody who is from the middle part of the United States, who is not as perceived as being politically progressive as somebody who represents New York or Massachusetts or some other major city and urban part of the United States. You don't attack them and try to primary them by putting somebody who's more extreme and thus in a position to not be able to win a general election. So while you know, our faith in sort of, you know, Downsian median voter theory kind of, you know, got shaken up by the 2016 election. There's still parts of it that work and that makes sense. And so, you know, so trying to tell the squad sort of like, you know, when you should actually try to get sort of a, you know, a lazy sort of old fashioned Democrat out versus when not, it's fine. I think that that's going to be the test. Those people who are representing those districts where the margin between the Democratic and the Republican victory was small in the presidential and the general race, or the places where you had the Democrat who won in a district that Trump won, you know, I think that there is legitimate concern about those folks. I mean, in the same way that we would have been concerned in 2018 about the moderate Republicans, the ones that you can actually work with, being shunted out of this because of the sorting that we were seeing happen. You know, it's still a real concern. And I think Democrats are going to have to be mindful of that in order to just keep their numerical majorities, and knowing that they can't govern as though they have a supermajority, even and especially if we move towards a majoritarian system, is also something that's really important.
Okay. Des, do you want to add anything? Okay.
I'll take the next question.
Yes. Do you want to, Des, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, I can start on that. I mean, it's a, do you want to read it out, Steve, first?
Sure. The question is from Elzbieta that has to do with federal power, that as many of our speakers have noted, the importance of federal power to addressing inequality and helping minorities over time. But then opposition to federal power and the protection of state sovereignty is effectively fueling support for white supremacist groups. And then the question is, how do we deal with this tendency, and how can we possibly overcome this trend?
Well, I hope this panel, this questionnaire is a student of American politics, because you've put your finger precisely on the biggest problem and the fault line that is driving a lot of what we're talking about. You're absolutely right. The Constitution was designed to ensure enslavement was maintained, and it was done by privileging certain states. And that arrangement has really remained there ever since. All of the rules that other panelists have been talking about, such as the filibuster and the disproportionality of the Senate and the laughable election system, are all manifestations of that. motive. So it's really crucial and core to the system. How it gets resolved is the great quandary about the system. Gary Gertzel, in his brilliant book, which he calls, being an optimist, he calls Liberty and Coercion. If I'd titled it, I would have called it Coercion and Liberty, which is a big study of American power since the beginning of since the late 18th century. He focuses in on this power, the power of the states, and thinks about a contracting process, which is always then, sorry, an expanding process for some activism at the federal level, which is then always countered and pushed back. And it's contracted to ensure that the states remain pivotal, and that basically the overwhelming majority, the system is designed to ensure enduring inequality and unequal power. So I think it goes back to my very first point when I was asked by Steve about the challenges. Is there any capacity to recognize the ideological crisis that comes from the way the system was created, and the fact that enslavement was retained in the Constitution, and we're still living with the consequences of that. I think there are some things that could be done by the federal government quite sort of strategically to do something about state power. One issue in America, and this is very technical and grassrooty, is the significance of zoning laws, and by which as Europeans we mean planning regulations, which are obviously extremely significant in Europe too. But the issue of ensuring that certain types of buildings are built, certain types of residential, non-residential, and so forth, and the system is designed entirely to maintain segregation and to ensure that the current system remains unperturbed. This is something the federal government could probably do, could probably pass some laws on to try to inject some relief into the system. There are interesting questions there, whether it would clash with state constitutions and local authority and so forth. And there we would be looking to the court to help us. And the only positive thing the court has done, I said they've only done one positive thing in the last 30 years in respect to civil rights. And the one positive and rather surprising thing they've done is to accept the notion of disparate impact as an indicator of racial discrimination in housing patterns, i.e., without demonstrating an intentional act of prejudice, they accept that when you look at a particular pattern of residential housing, and you find that the racial outcomes are disparate, this can be described as discriminatory and subject to reform. They did so in an extremely prescribed way, and it was a case that came originally from Chicago. So I'm not getting too excited about it, but it was one thing that happened there. So there are things like that that need to be done to get at state laws on that basis. But I mean, this is why the court, I think, is so significant, because it's the federal court for the jurisprudence of the whole 50 states. So when it decides on something or decides not to act on something, that's what makes a big difference.
I just add something to that. I mean, I think it's a very good question, and Des has, and I agree with everything Des just said. Right on. Let me, though, suggest. Someone suggested earlier that there are things you can do to try to help people out, to shake up both the federalism question and the next question coming on, the urban-rural divide. Let me for a second cast a negative light on the Democrats. What has happened in the United States over the last 50 years is a rampant inequality that is unmatched by anything you've seen across the OECD. England has had a great increase, but from a much smaller base. So if you went back to 1970 and looked at the Gini index that measures inequality, you'd see the Americans a little lagging the European League, a little ahead of France, a little behind Japan, about on a level with France. If you look now, 50 years later, you'll see the United States has fallen away from the European League and is now playing in a South American league. Its inequality is a little bit better than Brazil, than Mexico and Brazil. The level of inequality has just soared in a way, as I say, that's unprecedented. And here's the problem. The Democrats, for good and bad reasons, have done nothing about it. Or to put it slightly more precisely, they have not persuaded people who are caught up in this fearful culture war that they have anything to do that might help them and not those other people, that will help people in the rural parts of America, that will help people in the southern parts of the United States, so that we have this huge economic earthquake in the United States without either party really addressing it in policy terms, and at least the Republicans addressing it in racist terms and nativist terms. Democrats have let them get away with it by not having a clear agenda. Biden is actually making a test of this now. And the test is, if I do lots of stuff to help people economically, will they drop their culture war because they're benefited economically? And I think that's a great test. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's as good an answer to this question as any I can think of. Try to get some real good policies, not hidden, as Ursula says, through through funny tax funky things that no one can understand by saying, oh, here's a check. We're going to help you out. I'm going to take care of childcare. If Biden actually manages to get some of that through in the next year, we'll have a really interesting test over the next few years. Do you care about your cultural hatreds and dislikes more than you'd actually like to do the things that'll help you prosper? And we'll see then about this passion for hating the feds, when it seems like the feds might actually do something to help, not those other people you don't like, but you yourself. And that's the great test of the next few years, I think, and the great hope of the Bidenites.
Okay. I think that Jim, you touched on in the rural urban divide question that Joni asked. Does anybody have anything else they want to add to that?
It's always been powerful in the United States. But remember, the United States is a rural country that grew up, went to town as it grew up. So when the Constitution was written, 96% of the American public was rural. And so that bias, this goes back to things that have been said earlier today, deep in the American set of rules. And so, I mean, I think the last answer I gave addresses this, but you can't underestimate the bias against the urban America. But the parties never really sorted quite that way. This is really the first political generation where urban rural is really sorted out, and we fully discover one to one party, one to the other, and we fully discover just the effects of the bias in those rules.
I mean, I think if there's one thing that I would add here, this is where the institutional features that already privilege small states actually end up sort of working in rural populations' defense, because they end up being overrepresented. So if you're in a small state that's mostly rural, you are guaranteed 2 Senate seats, even if you have a population of, where your entire state, could fit into like a neighborhood in New York City. So, so I mean, there are certain institutional features that I think people are going to be very reluctant to give up. And we forget the ways that the US Constitution was written to privilege states and to privilege minorities, numerical minorities, sort of in ways that 200 years later have really, really negative consequences. And so this is why we still see rural populations having outsized influence. That being said, as we're seeing populations shift to cities and we see this partisan kind of divide sort of map over rural and urban populations, you're going to see it at the state legislative level first before you see it probably at the national level, people coming to grips with the fact that, oh, wait a minute, you mean that big city in the state actually really does make up half or 60% of the population. And because of apportionment, they get more legislative seats. So I think in the next decade or so, there's probably going to be a reckoning in a lot of states where they haven't realized sort of what that population shift means politically.
Okay, thank you. So Leila has asked a great question here about which role can or should higher education play, especially political science, in fostering democracy and depolarizing. also reflecting on the claim that critiques that higher education has contributed to polarization. So this is an issue I think a lot about in my current role, and so I would welcome any thoughts from the panel members on this.
Steve, you're a political scientist of some note. Do you want to take this question?
Well, I mean, I think about it. I've been thinking about it a lot because there's a lot of, for example, push to on civic education. You know, there's been an Educating for Democracy legislation bill in Congress that it looked like it was initially going to sail through Congress that would provide funding for civic education, with the idea that this would essentially be a way of educating citizens and depolarizing, and there's a kind of widespread interest in this among many political scientists, but also, again, there's been widely supported by many policymakers. But now it's essentially gotten ensnared in the kind of polarization in Congress, and it looks like it's not going to get passed, and issues around critical race theory and other issues that, you know, are really had nothing to do with the original legislation are now stalling it. But I do think that there certainly is a role for political scientists, and particularly in terms of issues around civic education and what we teach in our classroom, that could potentially have a depolarizing effect and could contribute to, and I think it touches upon some of the things that you said, Jim, about the young people. And, you know, there's great interest in issues around, you know, community-based learning, you know, working in community organizations, you know, among young people, and connecting the classroom to the community in ways that would, again, promote less polarization. It touches upon some of the things that Ursula said about the potential value of deliberation, and to the extent that we can get our students engaged in that and promote that. I think that there is great potential, but again, it is also very challenging in the current polarized environment. So
I'm completely mystified by what's taught in American high schools. And I go back to Andrea's point earlier about these history teachers, which doesn't surprise me. But I mean, I just don't know what's the content. You know, what's the history? They don't know anything. So I'm in respect to this question, I think, you know, maybe we can do something at the university level, but there's a much bigger problem. It's just I don't know whether things have become. Well, I mean, I'm talking about 20 years ago, so not even now, when it's the polarization has intensified and these trivial debates are allowed to become incredibly divisive and damaging. So, you know, most Americans know that Japanese Americans were interned during the war, for instance? It's a basic question. My experience is they no idea. And you know, do they, aside from knowing about other really important issues in the way the country has developed and evolved, and it seems to me really problematic. Sorry, Jim, this is your area.
I would just add one more piece to that, and that is that populism in the United States has always had a deeply anti-intellectual flavor. You go back to the Jacksonian Americans, they, you know, a judge, a doctor has no more knowledge than a barber. And indeed, American medicine, for example, was dismal by European standards throughout the 19th century, precisely because of this anti-intellectual flavor.
No, you're right, and I mean, it's a paradox again, because mandatory education began extremely early in the US compared to other industrial democracies. The requirement of elementary school, at least primary school.
Yes, for fear that foreigners would bring foreign values, and we had to promote our values.
Exactly.
Making the schools, as you say, an area of contention right from the start, because that's going to pass on our culture. I would say, you know, we've had these arguments now. Should they teach creationism, for heaven's sakes? And in some places, This goes back to Andra's comment early about education. In some places, you have to balance out your conversation about evolution and Charles Darwin. But we see this in the enormous American battle against vaccinations. There are anti-vaxxers everywhere, of course, but my sense is they're most passionate in the United States. Again, and you can't tell me what to do. You may know some science. So we're really grappling with that.
Well, one of the things that I would add here is that we as political scientists, particularly those of us who are ensconced at elite universities, don't have incentives to actually do civics education, even though I think we have a civic responsibility to be able to do so. If you write the readable book that has mass appeal, that doesn't have like a whole bunch of really complicated math in it, right? It doesn't get reviewed well, so you don't get tenure. So we are very disincentivized from actually contributing to this conversation, though we could actually contribute. And I think sometimes how we train and what we privilege and value in terms of scholarship is going to have to evolve in order to be able to meet that moment. And there are a lot of people who've done really well under the old system. And so they are standing in the way as gatekeepers to prevent that type of change and that type of evolution from happening because they don't want it dumbed down. But I mean, it could also be political scientists should try to, get on school boards because I mean, the reason why our textbooks are terrible is because Texas controls the textbook market. And so because that is the biggest textbook market in the United States, you cater to them. And so if they want to call slaves volunteer workers, then that happens and then that proliferates across the country. But I think we have to make space and recognize in terms of, our promotions, in terms of what our merit pay looks like, this really important work of educating people for good citizenship. And I think, it also means that we don't delegate teaching introductory American government classes to graduate students, right? I think, full-fledged professors are the ones who need to be at the helm of that. But most of the time, we don't want to teach those service classes because we think we're too busy and we're too important, or we paid our dues a long time ago. And I think we're going to have to sort of change that. We're going to have to change that mentality and change that mindset and change the incentive structure.
Hear, hear. I think that's a great crusade, and I'm signing on.
And I would just add as well, a lot of the things that Andra and Des have mentioned here, this is not just a US focused issue. I mean, these are problems that afflict the whole profession of political science and the incentive structures and our own education system. Des, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of the content of our own history and our own politics courses in British schools. And so, I mean, I think that there's a lot of this stuff. These are much broader questions, but they're things that I think that our respective political science associations are trying to do some things about. I mean, the American Political Science Association and the PSA as well in the UK. I mean, they've got a lot of focus on political science education, trying to kind of break down that boundary between the schools and communities as well, and the higher education establishment. But I think it's pretty tough.
Thank you. I think we've got one more question here, and we probably have time for one more question. Peter has asked, many studies have shown that the role of new social media and audience segmentation and polarization. Is this a development that needs addressing? What does everybody think about it on the panel?
So Steve, before we go, I just want to reinforce what Ursula said, because in case it's seen as just a peculiarly American issue, it's not, and it's a huge debate here in this country, partly generated by the movement for Black Lives Matters, which was already a lot of attention to these questions in the UK about lack of attention to communities of color in its history and in its curriculum and its education, but that issue has become salient and important, and is mobilizing a conservative opposition in exactly the same way that it has done with Republicans in the States. There's a reclaim history movement that has set up to put the record straight and so forth. So it's really important. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's just, I think what Ursula says is very important, because we don't want to pillory the United States is unique in this basis. And if you move to Netherlands and Germany and Sweden, Belgium and so forth, you're going to come across the same issues. Sorry, Jim.
I was just going to say about the media, it's a great point, worth interrupting for. I was going to say, on the one hand, there's no doubt that the new media is transformational. Look at us here having a conference on our computers. So absolutely transformational, and pick your issue. The Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, all come about because of new technologies and new ways of changing them. I would only caution too much exaggeration with one reflection. I'm sorry, not too much emphasis on social media, and that is this, that every time we've transformed our way of media, at least in American history, we've had enormous political effects, and it took the system more or less time to figure ways to digest it, whether it was the penny newspapers in the 1830s, the mass press in the 80s, 1880s and 90s. Remember, they are credited for starting a war with the yellow press of the 1890s, radio
Citizen
in the
Kane.
1930s. Yeah. Citizen Kane, exactly. You just let me worry about the war. You find the scandals. I'll create the war, as William Randolph Hearst says. Television transforming things in the Kennedy era, the Eisenhower Kennedy era. Sometimes the system has been better at thinking up a new set of rules. We are now in such a partisan and maladroit era that we're much slower to figure out, my God, what do we do about Facebook? But before we say that the system has been transformed forever, I would just say that each of those prior transformations has eventually been digested by the political system. And it may be that we will figure out how to change the rules of play in order to accommodate the new media, just as we did for television, and before that, just as we did for the penny newspapers, which really shook things up back in the 1830s. So I think this will be a very interesting conversation over the next 10 years. And it's one place where you actually might find Democrats and Republicans, particularly the crusty old people in Congress, Democrats and Republicans, agreeing on things.
Well, if there's one thing that I would add to this, I think about it from the citizen side, and think about this in terms of data literacy and understanding what is actually representative of a larger pool. And so I think, one, there are people who think that because they saw it on social media, it must be true, or that because I saw it in my feeds that everybody thinks the same way that I do. And I don't think we have an appreciation for what really good public opinion research, with random populations looks like. And public opinion has gotten a bad rap in recent years because they can't perfectly predict election results. And I think APOR sort of looking into this by saying, okay, we need to do better with sampling is somewhat inconclusive. The problem is that you shouldn't look to a survey with a sample of 1,500 or 800 people and expect it to perfectly predict what certain election results are. That's not what a poll does. It's supposed to tell you a range. And I don't think people understand that in the same way that they don't understand that, when they're looking at their Twitter feed or their Facebook feed, that's a convenient sample. And I think because we don't have very data literate populations in that way, they can really kind of get caught up in the bubble and not understand. So one of the things that I do try to tell my students, and even though this isn't necessarily representative, is that they often come from pretty homogeneous environments. And I'm less sanguine than James is about thinking about younger people, because we still see racial divides even amongst definitely millennials, because there's a lot of work that's been done there. Think about Candace Watt-Smith and Christopher LeCont's book, Racial Stasis, but also we'll increasingly see this with Gen Zers. And so we're seeing the journalists like 538 and Pew kind of see this kind of phenomenon going on, where you see whites of this generation still being markedly different than their counterparts of color. It's just that there are now more people of color to offset it. But that sort of as an aside, it's like you need to make sure that you get to know people who are different from you, people who are from different parts of the country. So in particular, at the type of school where I work at, you need to know people from flyover country. And I don't mean people from Chicago, like that really doesn't count. So you need to know people who are of different religious views than you are. You need to know people whose, sexual politics are different than yours, so that you can actually kind of understand where people are coming from. And I think people think they get that in social media, but they don't. And now they're more susceptible to misinformation. And, this is one place where I do a lot of media work. If there's one way that I would actually be critical of media, is that they do take their lead from social media. Like sometimes stuff that ends up hitting the news cycle is because people saw it on Twitter or Facebook trending. And I don't know if that's actually the right decision about making decisions about what should be making, like, you know, your 6:30 news broadcast. And I think in some ways we're going to have to do better about that. But, you know, I agree with Jim that that's going to evolve over time, and we're going to hopefully get better and more learned in terms of how we approach that.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, thank you, Steve.
I think we're at the end here. Anybody have any concluding comments? Des, Ursula?
I mean, that last question, I just did want to, the one thing I would add in is that Trump, it seemed to me, brought the use of social media to a new level in 2016. And he understood it, the capacity that he found in being able to communicate directly to people was I think decisive and important for him in that amongst the other factors. And it exposed the fact we don't understand the algorithm being used by the private big tech firms in terms of ensuring that people get the same stuff, reinforcing what they're hearing. But I think I learned a lot from Andra's contribution and assessment there, which I haven't thought about, so it's very helpful.
Thank you. Okay. Ursula, you want anything else?
Nothing to add, just to say thanks so much, Steve, for this fantastic panel and for the contributions of the fellow panelists, including Jacob as well.
Okay. Well, thanks to everybody. This has been a great panel. I really appreciate your participation.